The night he bought her, he thought he gained control, but he had just invited chaos into his empire. The room was built beneath the surface of the city, far from anything that resembled law, morality, or consequence. It was not hidden because it needed to be. It was hidden because it was never meant to be found. Dim lighting stretched across polished concrete floors, casting long shadows that blurred faces and intentions alike. The air carried a controlled silence, not empty, but deliberate. Every person present understood where they were, and more importantly, what kind of power operated within these walls. This was not an auction of objects. It was an auction of control, and control always came at a price. Sebastian Wolf did not arrive like the others. He did not need to. His presence entered the room before he did, carried through subtle shifts in attention, in posture, in silence. Conversations lowered, movement slowed, and the unspoken awareness of authority settled across the space, like a quiet command. He was not just powerful. He was inevitable. Sebastian did not compete. He acquired. That was the difference. His reputation was not built on noise or display. It was built on precision, on decisions that never needed to be repeated, on outcomes that never left room for doubt. People did not fear him because of what he might do. They feared him because of what he always did, and that certainty was absolute. Naira Hale stood at the edge of the room, not placed there by chance, but positioned like everything else that would eventually be evaluated, measured, and claimed. From the outside, she appeared exactly what the environment suggested she was. Still, quiet, unremarkable, a presence waiting to be defined. But stillness, in a place like this, was not always weakness. Sometimes it was control. Her posture revealed nothing. Her expression remained neutral, untouched by the tension that moved through the room. While others shifted subtly, whether from anticipation or unease, Naira remained unchanged, because she was not waiting. She was observing. The intellectual hook settled silently within the atmosphere. The most dangerous person in a room full of power is the one who has nothing to prove. Naira had nothing to prove, and nothing to reveal. That was why she remained invisible, until she wasn't. The auction began without announcement. It did not need one. Everything in this world moved with understanding, not instruction. Figures were presented, evaluated, measured through glances, through silence, through the quiet calculations of men who did not waste time on unnecessary decisions. Each moment carried weight. Each choice had consequence. And when Naira's turn came, nothing about her changed. She did not react to being brought forward. She did not resist the attention. She did not acknowledge the shift in focus. Because attention, she understood, was temporary. But perception lasted. Sebastian's gaze found her instantly, not because she demanded it, but because she did not. That was what separated her from everything else in the room. She did not try to be seen. And because of that, she stood out. His attention was not curious. It was decisive. Sebastian did not observe for long. He did not question what he saw, because questioning suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty did not exist within him. He assessed, calculated, concluded. That was how he operated. And in that moment, his conclusion was simple. She was an asset, unclaimed, unprotected, available, and therefore valuable. The power imbalance between them was immediate, obvious, undeniable. He stood as control. She stood as something to be controlled. And the room accepted that without hesitation, because that was how this world worked. Value was assigned. Ownership was established. And once established, it was never questioned. Sebastian made his move, not dramatically, not forcefully, but with certainty. The kind of certainty that did not allow interruption, did not allow negotiation, did not allow refusal. The decision was made, and with that decision, the dynamic shifted. Naira was no longer part of the room. She was part of his world. Or, at least, that was what everyone believed. The space adjusted around that reality instantly. The tension dissolved into acceptance. The structure of the room returned to its controlled rhythm. Because once Sebastian Wolf claimed something, it belonged to him. That was the rule. The only rule that mattered. Naira felt the shift, not as pressure, not as fear, but as confirmation. She had been placed exactly where she needed to be, and that was the part no one understood, because from the outside, it looked like she had been taken, purchased, reduced to something transactional, something without choice. But inside, the truth was different. She had not been placed into his world. She had entered it, willingly, deliberately, and now she was inside. Sebastian did not look at her again immediately. He did not need to. Ownership in his world did not require constant attention. It required control. And control, once established, maintained itself. But Naira looked, not directly, not openly, but enough to study, enough to understand, enough to recognize something important. He was exactly what she expected. Cold, precise, unquestioning. A man who believed control was absolute, and that belief was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, because absolute control does not prepare for the unexpected. And Naira Hale was exactly that, unexpected. The environment around them stabilized. The moment passed. The transaction was complete. Everything returned to normal. But beneath that normal, something had changed. Something small. Something invisible. Something no one in the room could detect. A single variable introduced into a system that did not allow variables. And variables change everything. Naira remained silent as she was moved from the space, not resisting, not reacting, not revealing, because her role, for now, was still being underestimated. And that was exactly where she needed to be. The realization settled into her with quiet certainty, not emotional, not reactive, but absolute. He believed he had gained control, but in reality, he had opened his world to something he could not define. And anything that cannot be defined cannot be controlled. As the night closed around them and the illusion of ownership settled into place, one final truth remained, sharp, quiet, and dangerously real. As he claims her, she realizes he has no idea who he just brought into his world. Long before he owned her present, her past had already been written in blood. The moment Sebastian Wolf claimed Naira Hale had not changed who she was. It had only changed where she stood. Because long before she entered his world, long before she allowed herself to be seen as something silent and easily defined, Naira had already lived through something far more dangerous than control. She had lived through collapse. Not the kind that happens suddenly, but the kind that unfolds slowly, piece by piece, moment by moment, until everything that once felt certain disappears. And what remains is survival. Naira had not been born into weakness. She had been born into power, not the visible kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that exists beneath the surface, structured, dangerous, inherited. Her bloodline was not unknown. It was erased, deliberately, carefully, because names in the world she came from were not just identities. They were targets, and her name had once been one of the most dangerous. The intellectual hook settled into the silence of her memory. The most powerful families are not the ones you hear about. They're the ones that disappear without a trace. Naira's family had disappeared, not by accident, not by time, but by force. There had been a war, not loud, not public, but precise, calculated, brutal in a way that did not leave room for recovery. It had not destroyed everything, but it had destroyed enough to break structure, enough to scatter power, enough to leave behind nothing but fragments. And Naira had been one of those fragments. She had not witnessed everything, but she had seen enough to understand that survival did not depend on strength. It depended on invisibility. That was the first lesson, the most important one, because strength attracts attention, and attention leads to destruction. So she adapted, not by fighting, not by resisting, but by disappearing. Her identity was not lost. It was buried, layer by layer, detail by detail, until nothing about her connected to what she once was. The name Naira Hale was not who she had always been. It was who she had become, a constructed identity, carefully built, carefully maintained, designed to survive in a world that had already taken everything from her once. and would do it again if given the chance. The trauma she carried was not visible. It never was, because pain, when controlled long enough, stops showing. It becomes internal, structured, contained. She did not allow herself to remember everything, not all at once, because memory without control creates weakness, and weakness was something she had removed from herself. But certain fragments remained, moments that had shaped her understanding of the world, moments that had defined what survival truly meant. Loss, not just of people, but of certainty, of identity, of everything that once made sense. Betrayal, not unexpected, but inevitable, because trust in her world was never permanent, only temporary. And temporary things do not last. Survival, not by chance, not by luck, but by decision. A decision she had made early and never questioned again. She would not be erased, no matter what it took. That was the foundation of everything she became. Her dual identity was not a contradiction. It was a necessity. The version of her the world saw, quiet, controlled, unremarkable, was not false. It was incomplete, a surface, a layer designed to protect what existed beneath. And beneath that surface was something entirely different, something precise, something aware, something that had been shaped by loss, refined by survival, and controlled by purpose. Naira did not pretend to be weak. She allowed others to believe she was, because belief is easier to control than truth, and control was everything. Her reason for hiding had evolved over time. At first, it had been survival, a simple need to exist without being found, without being recognized, without becoming a target again. But survival alone does not sustain purpose. It only delays outcome. So her purpose changed, not suddenly, but gradually, as understanding replaced fear, as awareness replaced confusion, as control replaced reaction. Her existence became something else. Something intentional, not just to survive, but to position, to observe, to understand a world that had destroyed hers, because understanding creates power, and power can be used, not recklessly, not emotionally, but strategically. The idea of revenge did not consume her. It did not drive her actions blindly, because revenge without control leads to failure, and failure was not an option. Instead, she carried something far more dangerous. Patience, the kind that does not rush, the kind that does not reveal itself, the kind that waits until everything aligns, and then acts. Naira had waited, for years, for the right moment, the right position, the right entry point. And now, she had it. Sebastian Wolf, his world, his system, his empire, everything she had once been separated from, now stood in front of her, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Because power, no matter how strong, always connects. And those connections lead back to something, or someone. The realization formed clearly now, not as suspicion, but as certainty. Her past was not separate from his world. It never had been. The war that destroyed her family was not isolated. It was part of something larger, something ongoing, something that still existed. And Sebastian was part of it. Maybe not directly, maybe not knowingly, but connected, because power does not operate in isolation. It overlaps, intertwines, collides, and somewhere within that collision, her past and his present aligned. That was why she was here, not by accident, not by chance, but by design. Her design, the clarity settled into her completely. Everything she had done, everything she had become, every step she had taken, had led her here, to him, to this moment, to this system. And now, she was inside it, exactly where she needed to be. As the weight of her past aligned with the reality of her present, one final realization emerged, sharp, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Looking back, it becomes clear her past is directly connected to his biggest enemy. He ruled everything without fear, but he had never faced something he didn't understand. Naira Hale did not enter Sebastian Wolf's empire as someone new. She entered it as someone prepared. because by the time she stood within his world, she already understood something most people never did. Power is not what you see. It is what everything else moves around. And Sebastian's world moved around him. It was not chaotic. It was not unstable. It was controlled. Every detail, every movement, every decision flowed through a system that had been built with precision and reinforced through consequence. Nothing existed without purpose. Nothing happened without direction. Even silence had structure. That was what made his empire dangerous. Not its size, not its reach, but its consistency. The intellectual hook settled into her awareness with clarity. The most dangerous empires are not built on fear alone. They are built on predictability. And Sebastian Wolf's empire was predictable, not to everyone, but to someone who knew how to observe. Naira moved through his world without resistance, not because she accepted it, but because she was studying it. Every space she entered, every moment she experienced, every interaction she witnessed, none of it passed without analysis. She was not looking at the surface. She was looking at the structure beneath it, because structure reveals weakness. Sebastian's presence defined everything, not loudly, not aggressively, but absolutely. He did not need to assert authority. It existed naturally. The people around him did not question him. They aligned with him, because alignment meant safety, and safety was controlled. That was how he maintained power, not by forcing loyalty, but by making disloyalty impossible. Naira recognized it immediately, because she had seen it before, in a different form, in a different world, one that had been destroyed, but not forgotten. The patterns were familiar, and familiarity created clarity. Sebastian's mindset was simple, not because it lacked depth, but because it rejected complication. People were not individuals. They were assets, each one assigned value, each one placed within a role, each one maintained as long as they remained useful. And once they were no longer useful, they were removed, cleanly, quietly, without disruption. That was his system, efficient, unforgiving, complete. Naira understood her place within it, or at least the place he believed she occupied. To him, she was controlled, defined, contained, something he had acquired and positioned within his structure, something that existed because he allowed it to. But that perception was incomplete, because while he observed her as part of his system, she observed him as something to understand. That was the difference. And that difference changed everything. Sebastian watched her, not constantly, but deliberately. His attention was precise, focused only when necessary. And she had become necessary, not because she had done anything obvious, but because she had done something subtle. She had remained unchanged. In a world that demanded reaction, she did not react. That alone was enough to create awareness. Naira felt it, the shift in his observation, the way his attention returned to her more often, the way her presence was no longer background, but not yet foreground either. She existed in between, and that position was powerful because it allowed her to be seen without being understood. She did not change her behavior, not significantly, because significant change creates patterns, and patterns create exposure. Instead, she remained consistent, but controlled. Her movements were deliberate, her silence intentional, her presence balanced between visibility and invisibility, enough to exist, not enough to be defined. Sebastian noticed, because he noticed everything. That was what made him dangerous. But even he did not notice everything correctly. That was what made him vulnerable. The contrast between them sharpened with time. He believed he controlled the system completely. She knew control always had limits. He believed she existed within his structure. She knew she was moving through it. He believed he understood everything around him. She knew understanding required more than observation. It required perspective, and his perspective was incomplete. Naira began to map his empire, not physically, but structurally. She observed how decisions moved, where authority concentrated, where influence weakened, where patterns repeated, because repetition creates predictability. and predictability creates opportunity. She did not act on what she learned. Not yet, because knowledge without timing is useless, and timing required patience. Something she had mastered long ago. Sebastian's attention deepened, not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically. He began to analyze her presence, the way she positioned herself, the way she responded or didn't, the way her behavior remained controlled. Even in moments that should have created disruption, it did not align, and misalignment demands explanation. But explanation requires information, and Naira controlled what information existed. That was her advantage. He could observe her, but he could not define her. Not completely. Not yet. The tension between them remained silent, unspoken, but undeniable, because awareness, once established, does not disappear. It grows, slowly, subtly, until it cannot be ignored. Naira allowed it to grow, because attention, when guided, becomes influence, and influence was what she needed, not control. Not yet, just influence. The system remained stable, unchanged on the surface. Sebastian still ruled everything. His empire remained intact. His authority remained absolute. But beneath that stability, something had shifted, something small, something invisible, a single inconsistency, a variable that did not follow the rules. Naira Hale, and variables change systems, even the strongest ones. As the silent tension between observation and awareness deepened, one final truth emerged. Quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Someone close to him starts noticing. She's not reacting like someone who's powerless. The truth didn't reveal itself. It slipped out in a moment that couldn't be undone. Up until that point, Naira Hale had remained exactly where she needed to be. Unseen, undefined, untouched by suspicion. Her presence inside Sebastian Wolf's empire had been controlled with precision. Every movement measured, every silence intentional, every reaction carefully calculated to maintain the illusion that she was exactly what she appeared to be, nothing more than something he owned. But control, no matter how perfect, is never absolute, because even the most calculated systems have moments, small ones, unpredictable ones, moments where structure loosens just enough for something hidden to surface. And when it does, it cannot be undone. The shift began with something insignificant, so small it should have meant nothing. A detail, a reaction, a fraction of a second where control slipped, not completely, not visibly, but enough for the wrong person to notice. The intellectual hook settled into the tension quietly. The truth doesn't need to be revealed. It only needs one moment to escape. And that moment had happened. Naira did not realize it immediately, because from her perspective, nothing had changed. Her behavior remained controlled. Her presence remained balanced. Her role remained intact. But systems do not react instantly. They process, they adjust, they observe before they respond. And somewhere within that process, a crack had formed. The first sign came not from Sebastian, but from someone closer to him, someone who understood his system not just as structure, but as instinct. Adrian Cross. He was not the most powerful man in the room, but he was one of the most aware, because while others followed Sebastian's authority, Adrian understood it, and understanding makes you dangerous in a different way. He had been watching Naira long before this moment, not directly, not obviously, but enough to notice what others ignored: the lack of fear, the consistency of her control, the absence of reaction where reaction should exist. It had not been enough to raise suspicion, until now, because now something had changed, not visibly, but structurally. A detail had surfaced, a connection that did not belong, a response that carried recognition instead of ignorance. And Adrian saw it, not fully, not clearly, but enough to question. And questions are where everything begins. Naira felt the shift, not as confrontation, but as awareness. The way attention moved around her, the way space adjusted slightly, the way silence carried more weight than before. She had been noticed, not completely, but enough, and that was dangerous, because partial awareness is more unpredictable than full understanding. It creates tension, uncertainty, movement without direction. Naira did not panic. She did not react, because reaction would confirm everything. Instead, she did what she had always done. She stabilized. Internally, immediately, her thoughts sharpened, her awareness expanded, her control tightened. Because once a crack appears, it must be managed, not erased, because erasing draws attention, but controlled so it does not spread. Sebastian had not reacted yet, but that did not mean he hadn't noticed. It meant he was observing, analyzing, waiting, because men like him do not move without certainty, and certainty requires confirmation. The tension between control and exposure began to build, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, within the structure, within the system, within the awareness of those who understood how to see it. Naira adjusted. Subtly, she reduced movement, limited presence, refined behavior, not to disappear, but to rebalance perception, because perception, once disrupted, must be corrected carefully. Too much correction creates suspicion. Too little allows it to grow. The hidden connection began to form beneath the surface, not fully visible, but undeniable. Fragments of her past aligning with fragments of his world. Names, patterns, decisions, moments that should not connect, beginning to overlap. And that overlap was dangerous, because Sebastian's empire did not tolerate unknown connections. Everything within it was defined, tracked, controlled, and Naira was becoming undefined. Adrian's observation deepened. He did not confront her. He did not report immediately, because he was not certain. But he was close. And closeness is enough, because once something feels wrong, it does not stop feeling wrong. Naira recognized it, the shift in his focus, the subtle change in how he watched her, not openly, but consistently. And that consistency was a problem, because consistency leads to clarity, and clarity leads to truth. The emotional tension within her remained controlled, not fear, but awareness, because she understood something critical. Exposure is not immediate. It is gradual, and if managed correctly, it can still be redirected, but only if handled perfectly. And perfection was difficult under pressure. The pressure was building now, not from one direction, but from multiple. Adrian's awareness, Sebastian's observation, the system's subtle adjustments, everything aligning toward one outcome. Discovery, not complete, not yet, but approaching. The final moment came without warning, as all important moments do. A connection, small, unavoidable, a detail that should not have existed within a system, but did. A name, a pattern, a link to something buried, something erased, something connected to the very enemy Sebastian believed had been eliminated long ago, and that connection could not be ignored. It was too precise, too aligned, too real. Naira saw it the moment it happened, felt it, understood it, because once something surfaces, you know, immediately, that it cannot be taken back. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, carrying the weight of something that had just shifted beyond control. As the realization settled into place, one final truth emerged, sharp, irreversible, and impossible to contain. One small mistake exposes a connection that could destroy everything. She didn't start the war, but her existence made it inevitable. The moment the connection surfaced, everything changed, not visibly, not immediately, but structurally, because in a world built on control, one exposed truth is enough to shift the balance of power. And Naira Hale had just become that truth. The system did not react with chaos. It never did. Sebastian Wolf's empire did not fracture under pressure. It tightened. Movements became more precise, communication more controlled, decisions more deliberate. From the outside, nothing appeared different, but beneath that surface, everything had begun to move. The intellectual hook settled into the silence like a quiet warning. Wars don't begin when enemies attack. They begin when the truth reaches the wrong people. And the truth had reached them. It did not take long. Secrets in this world did not remain contained, not when they were connected to something larger, not when they carried the weight of past conflicts, not when they involved names that were supposed to be gone. Naira's past was not just resurfacing. It was being recognized by the wrong side, the rival network, one that had once clashed with her bloodline, one that had been reduced but never fully erased, began to react, not openly, not recklessly, but strategically, because like Sebastian, they did not operate through impulse. They operated through calculation. The first signs were subtle. Disruptions, interruptions in movement, information that did not arrive where it should, decisions that were delayed, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to signal presence. Because presence in a controlled system means intrusion. Sebastian noticed immediately. He always did. But this time, his reaction was different. Not because the disruption was unfamiliar, but because of what it pointed toward. Naira, the connection aligned too precisely to ignore. The timing, the nature of the interference, the structure of the response. It all led back to one conclusion. She was not just involved. She was central. The realization did not create hesitation. It created clarity. Sebastian did not question whether she was connected. He understood that she was. The question was, how deep did it go? The tension escalated, not through confrontation, but through positioning. His empire adjusted. Security tightened. Movements restricted. Observation increased. Everything recalibrated around a new variable. Her. Naira felt it, not as fear, but as recognition. The system had shifted, not against her, but around her, because now she was no longer invisible. She was relevant, and relevance creates risk, but also power. The rival side began to move more directly, still controlled, still measured, but unmistakable. Information leaks became intentional. Signals appeared where none should exist. Patterns formed that pointed toward one objective. They knew, not everything, but enough to act, and that was the beginning of war. Naira did not react outwardly. She did not panic, because panic belongs to those who are unprepared, and she had always been prepared. What she had not expected was the speed, the precision, the way everything aligned so quickly once the truth surfaced. But even that did not break her control. It sharpened it, because now everything was clear. There was no more hiding, no more partial positioning, no more waiting. The war she had avoided had found her, and not just her. Sebastian Wolf, his empire, his control, everything he had built was now part of it. The shift in his perception of her became absolute. She was no longer an asset, no longer something he had acquired, no longer something within his system. She was a trigger, a catalyst, the center of a conflict that had existed long before she entered his world, and would continue long after. The realization settled into him with cold precision. He had not brought her into his empire. He had brought the war. The emotional tension between them changed, not softened, not resolved, but intensified, because now their connection was no longer undefined. It was dangerous, not because of what they were to each other, but because of what they represented. Two forces, now aligned within the same space, against something larger. The power tension rose sharply, not through action, but through understanding. Sebastian began to calculate differently, not how to control her, but what her existence meant, what it cost, what it risked, because for the first time, something inside his system could not be contained. Naira, and everything connected to her. His options became clear, limited, dangerous. Keep her, and the war comes to him. Let her go, and lose control of something he does not fully understand. Neither outcome was acceptable, and that was the problem. Naira understood it too. The position they now shared. Not allies, not enemies, but something far more unstable. Connected through conflict, through truth, through a war neither of them had fully chosen, but now could not avoid. The system tightened further, not collapsing, but preparing, because war in this world does not arrive loudly. It builds, silently, until it is unavoidable. And now it was. As the weight of everything settled into place, sharp, inevitable, and irreversible, one final realization emerged. He realizes keeping her might cost him everything, but letting her go might be worse. The moment she stopped hiding, he realized he was never in control. The war had already begun to take shape, not through explosions or open conflict, but through tension, tight controlled, and spreading through every layer of Sebastian Wolf's empire. Every movement now carried weight. Every decision had consequence. And at the center of it all was Naira Hale. Up until this point, she had remained contained within perception, silent, measured, undefined. But war does not allow silence to remain neutral. It forces revelation. And Naira was done hiding. The shift did not come through dramatic action. It came through clarity. The intellectual hook settled into space between them with quiet force. The moment you stop hiding your truth, you take control away from those who thought they defined you. That was exactly what happened. Naira did not change who she was. She allowed him to finally see it. Her presence remained calm, controlled, unshaken by the growing tension surrounding them. But something within her had sharpened, no longer held back, no longer filtered to fit within his system. She was no longer playing a role. She was standing as herself. And that difference was impossible to ignore. Sebastian saw it immediately, not because she revealed everything, but because she revealed enough. Enough to break the illusion, enough to destroy the version of her he had constructed in his mind. The silence between them carried a different weight now, not undefined, not uncertain, but precise, because everything that had once been hidden was now aligning into truth. Naira's movements became deliberate, not cautious, not restrained, but intentional. She no longer adjusted herself to fit within his expectations. She allowed her actions to exist independently of them, and that independence was what made her dangerous. She revealed fragments, not all, never all, but enough. Enough for him to understand that her past was not just connected to the war. It was part of its foundation. Enough for him to see that she had not been running from something. She had been navigating toward it, and him had been part of that path. The realization hit with sharp precision, not slowly, not gradually, but completely. He had not found her. She had positioned herself. That truth changed everything. His reaction did not come as chaos. Sebastian Wolf did not lose control outwardly. He never did. But internally, the shift was undeniable. Shock came first, not because he was unfamiliar with threats, but because he had not identified her as one from the beginning. And that failure was unacceptable. Anger followed, not explosive, not reckless, but controlled, cold, focused, because anger, when refined, becomes strategy, and strategy was where he operated best. But beneath both of those was something else, something he did not expect. Fascination, not emotional, not impulsive, but structural, because what she had done was not simple. It was not accidental. It was precise, calculated, executed over time. She had entered his world without detection, maintained her position, and revealed herself only when it mattered most. That level of control demanded recognition, even from him, especially from him. The power dynamic between them shifted instantly, not subtly, not gradually, but completely. She was no longer something within his system. She was something that stood against it, not as opposition, but as equal force. And that was new, because Sebastian Wolf did not operate with equals. He created hierarchy, defined structure, maintained control, but Naira did not fit within that. She never had. He just hadn't seen it before. Now, he did. And once seen, it could not be undone. Naira did not push the shift further. She did not escalate, because escalation creates instability, and instability was not her objective. Control was, and control requires restraint. She held her position, not aggressively, not defensively, but with certainty, because she no longer needed to prove anything. The truth had already done that. Sebastian adjusted, not outwardly, but internally. His system recalibrated around her, not as an asset, not as something to control, but as something to account for. That was a shift. She had moved from within a system to something that influenced it. And influence is the beginning of power. The tension between them intensified, not through confrontation, but through understanding. Because now, everything was clear, not fully revealed, but enough. Enough to change how they saw each other. Enough to change how they operated. Enough to change everything. The question that remained was no longer simple. It was no longer about control, or ownership, or even survival. It was about something far more complex. Position, because if she had not been brought into his world by chance, if she had positioned herself there, then everything he believed about control was incomplete. The realization settled into him with cold clarity. For the first time in a long time, he was not certain, not about her, not about the situation, not about the system he had built. And uncertainty was something he did not allow. But now it existed because of her, as the silence between them stretched, sharp, controlled, and filled with unspoken understanding. One final question emerged. For the first time, he questions, did he bring her into his world, or did she walk into it? The truth didn't just explain her, it changed the entire war. By the time Sebastian Wolf began to question whether Naira had entered his world by design, the war was no longer forming. It was active, not openly, not violently, but strategically. Every movement now carried intention. Every silence held meaning. And at the center of it all was truth, not fragments, not suspicion, but the full weight of it. Because what had once been hidden could no longer remain concealed. The intellectual hook settled into the tension between them with sharp clarity. The most dangerous truth is not the one that reveals the past, but the one that reshapes the present. That was what this truth did. It did not just explain Naira. It redefined everything around her. The revelation did not come in a single moment. It unfolded, piece by piece, connection by connection, until the structure was complete. Naira Hale was not simply part of a fallen bloodline. She was its continuation, the last surviving link to a network that had once rivaled the very foundation of the current power structure, a network that had not been destroyed, only dismantled, scattered, hidden, waiting, and now re-emerging. Through her, Sebastian understood it fully now, not partially, not theoretically, but completely. She was not just connected to the war. She was central to it, a key, a trigger, a symbol, and more importantly, a threat that could not be ignored. The bigger picture aligned with brutal precision. The war had never truly ended. It had paused, shifted, moved beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And that moment had arrived, not because of chaos, not because of mistake, but because of her. Naira did not react to the truth becoming visible, because she had always known it. She had lived with it, carried it, controlled it. But now, it was no longer hers alone. It existed between them, within the system, within the war itself. And that changed everything. The emotional tension between them intensified, not simplified, not resolved, but sharpened, because now their connection was no longer undefined. It was rooted in truth, and truth is never neutral. Betrayal existed. It had to, because she had entered his world under a constructed identity, because she had allowed him to believe something that was not complete, because she had positioned herself within his system, without revealing her true purpose. And that was betrayal, even if it had been necessary, even if it had been calculated, even if it had been inevitable. But alongside that betrayal was something far more complicated. Connection, not emotional, not soft, but real, because their paths had not crossed by coincidence. They had aligned through power, through conflict, through a system that neither of them fully controlled. That connection could not be ignored, and that was what made it dangerous, because betrayal can be rejected, but connection remains. The roles between them shifted completely. not gradually, not subtly, but fundamentally. She was no longer something he had acquired, no longer something within his control, no longer something defined by a system. And he was no longer simply the one who ruled, the one who controlled, the one who decided. They stood differently now, not equal in power, but equal in awareness. And awareness is what changes the outcome of everything. Sebastian adjusted, not in resistance, not in rejection, but in understanding, because now that the truth was clear, the game had changed. This was no longer about control. It was about positioning within a war that had already begun, and positioning required precision. Naira held her ground, not aggressively, not defensively, but with clarity, because she no longer needed to hide. The truth had already revealed her, and now she could operate within it, fully, completely, dangerously. The tension between them settled into something new, not stable, not peaceful, but defined. A dynamic built on truth instead of illusion, on awareness instead of assumption, on something that could not be simplified into control or opposition, because it was both at the same time. The war outside continued to escalate, quietly, strategically, movements becoming more direct, signals becoming clearer, the rival force no longer hiding its presence, because now there was no reason to. Naira was visible, and that visibility changed everything. Sebastian's position within the war shifted as well, not because he had chosen it, but because it had chosen him. Through her, that was the reality, the one he could not ignore, the one he could not undo, the one he now had to face. His decision became inevitable, not easy, not simple, but clear. He would not remove her, he would not release her, because doing so would not end the war. It would only shift it beyond his reach. And Sebastian Wolf did not operate outside of control. Even in war, especially in war, the realization settled into place. Cold, final, unavoidable. She was not something he could eliminate, not without consequence, not without losing something far greater than control. And that changed everything. As the truth reshaped the war, the power, and everything between them, one final reality remained, sharp, dangerous, and impossible to deny. Even after everything, he refuses to let her go. The war wasn't the most dangerous thing anymore. She was, by the time the truth had fully reshaped the battlefield. The war itself no longer felt like the center of everything. It was still there, still growing, still inevitable, but it was no longer the most unpredictable force within Sebastian Wolf's world. That place now belonged to Naira Hale. The shift had not been sudden. It had been built, layer by layer, moment by moment. From the night she entered his world to the moment her truth became undeniable, everything had aligned toward this outcome, not by accident, not by chance, but by design. The intellectual hook settled into the silence between them with sharp clarity. The most dangerous weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that changes everything it touches. That was what she had become. Not destruction, not chaos, but transformation. And transformation cannot be controlled. Naira was no longer navigating his world. She had become part of its structure, not within it, but alongside it. Her presence no longer required concealment, no longer required adjustment, no longer required permission. She moved with clarity now, every decision intentional, every action precise, every moment grounded in awareness. She was no longer reacting to the war. She was shaping how it unfolded, not openly, not forcefully, but inevitably, because influence, once established, expands, and her influence had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Sebastian saw it, not as a loss, but as a reality. Because for the first time, something within his world existed outside of his direct control, yet remained within his reach. And that contradiction held his attention completely. His control had not disappeared. It had changed direction. Where it had once been applied to systems, to people, to outcomes, it now focused on something else. Her, not in the way he controlled others, not as something to dominate or define, but as something to understand. And understanding when it cannot be achieved fully, becomes fixation. The shift from control to obsession was not visible, not in the way others might recognize. There were no outward signs of instability, no disruption in his authority, no fracture in his system. But internally, the change was absolute, because she had become the one variable he could not resolve, the one presence that did not align with his structure, the one factor that influenced everything, without being controlled by anything. And that was something he could not ignore. The dynamic between them settled into its final form, not balanced, not stable, but defined. They were no longer positioned as opposites, not entirely. They existed in the same space, operating with different forms of power, connected through conflict, through truth, through something neither of them had chosen, but both had accepted. Equals, not in authority, not in influence, but in awareness. And awareness was what mattered most. Naira no longer needed to prove her strength. It existed, clearly, undeniably. She was no longer the woman who had been bought, no longer the presence that had been underestimated, no longer the unknown variable. She was something else entirely, something that could not be defined by a system, or anyone's, because she had built herself outside of it, through survival, through control, through a past that had shaped her into something precise, something calculated, something unstoppable. The war continued, but it no longer felt like the greatest threat, because war follows rules. Even when those rules are hidden, even when they are brutal, there is structure, there is direction, there is outcome. But Naira was not bound by those rules. She moved through the war, not against it, not within it, but beyond it, and that made her more dangerous than anything else on the field. Sebastian understood that completely, and yet he did not remove her, did not distance himself, did not attempt to break the connection that had formed, because that connection, though dangerous, was also something else, unavoidable, not because of weakness, but because of recognition. Power recognizes power, and once recognized, it does not disappear. It evolves. The tension between them remained constant, not explosive, not chaotic, but intense, because everything between them was unresolved, unfinished, uncontained, and that was what made it real. There was no clear end, no defined resolution, no moment where everything settled into something simple, because what existed between them was not simple. It was layered, complex, built on truth instead of illusion, and truth does not offer easy endings. Naira did not leave, not because she was trapped, but because she chose to remain. And that choice was what made everything permanent, because now nothing about this dynamic was forced, nothing was assumed, nothing was misunderstood. Everything existed exactly as it was. And still, it continued. As the war moved forward and the world around them adjusted to a new reality, one final truth remained. Quiet, haunting, and impossible to ignore. The war may end, but what she started inside him never will.